Okay, we're live. Hi, everybody. I am this guy, Stuart McMurray. I am a lead engineer on Klarna, the payment company's ever-growing offensive security team, pen testing, red teaming, that kind of things. Also just a good old-fashioned neckbeard Unix nerd. These slides should be tweeted now onto Twitter, so feel free to grab Twitter if you want a copy of the slides. Also, welcome. Worth mentioning that I'm not affiliated with any company or organization or cartel or anything of the sort which does defensive type things that we'll be talking about. So this is my own opinions. And even more so, it's not the opinions necessarily of my employer, past, present, future, and so on. Also, a typical disclaimer, please don't hack things if you're not allowed to. If you do, my name is George Washington. Keep that in mind when somebody asks. So, back to the talk. Quick TLDR of the talk. We have this problem that we don't really know if defensive tools work until the tools are tested. Point number two is you have to figure out how, who knows? Vendors are probably not the best to ask. And in fact, in my opinion, they're the worst people to ask because, I don't know, they're selling something. And the whole thesis behind the talk is the best people to ask are the blue teamers to figure out if their tools are working. And point three, it's, doing the testing itself is actually quite fun and it's pretty easy and it's an enjoyable thing to do. And that's sort of what we'll be talking about. So over the next 40 odd minutes, we'll talk about sort of the idea behind this talk. And then it's a little weird to say, yeah, blue teamers should be doing security testing. It's kind of like the opposite to what they normally do. Then we'll look at sort of my red-ish approach to a blue problem, and how to test things. And we'll take a quick case study that I was originally going to use a tool I've gone against, so to speak. We won't do that because that wouldn't be very nice. So the idea behind the talk is we have this problem. Every large organization with a network needs some sort of security tooling in place. We need the ability to find bad guys, stop bad guys, make reactions, so on and so forth. We have to figure out, though, if they actually work. And it turns out a lot of blue teams that I've talked to, they don't really know. They're like, yeah, we know what it should do. We know what it has done. We don't know if in the future it will keep doing. Also, these tools are ridiculously expensive. So, back before I moved over this way, I, of course, in the US had a car. And it would not occur to me to make a massive purchase that's multiple times my income without test driving. And I feel the same way about security tools. Multi-million dollars or euros of tooling, you probably should test it before you buy it. There is a counter argument to that, and that is that it's somebody else's budget, really. It shouldn't be on the budget of the organization buying the thing to figure out if the thing works, do dev work, basically, for the vendor. So there's a solution. Let's just see if this thing that we may be hoping to buy or may have bought already is actually worth the money. We'll just dig in and find out if it works. In the interest of a 40-minute talk, scope it down, though. So when I talk about a thing, a defensive tool, I really am talking about a single defensive thing. I'm talking about an EDR box, appliance, agent, what have you, a network traffic analysis thing, a firewall thing, maybe even a DNS server that's configured to be particularly hacker unfriendly. The same principles apply to what, in the modern world you get, it's a cyber analytics, a defense platform using AI and ML and threat intelligence and all that stuff. It's the same thing applies, tweaked a little, of course. And every so often you'll find yourself or find a situation where it's not just hey, I'm testing a thing. It's hey, we've hired this other team to, defend a part of the network, sort of an MSSP type thing. It works more or less the same, with some minor adjustments. And we're going to, again, scope it down to one question to answer. And the question is, does it work? Which in real life sometimes turns into okay, does it just work enough? Which actually in real life often turns into okay, does this thing do anything? And then sort of as a side quest, we'll like to also answer, and just how hard is it to get past it? I mean, most of these tools are not particularly impossible to bypass. So that's that. And that's just the fun bit anyways. So it's kind of your reward for doing all the work. And then the question is when you would do this. And hopefully you're doing this pre-purchase. Hopefully, somebody is hey, we need a new EDR product for whatever reason. Let's get a bunch of trials and test them and see what happens. I've done that. It's enjoyable for sure. And it's really helpful to see hey, the vendor, weren't being exactly forthcoming for this one, but this one works better. Probably more often it's post-purchase. It's hey, we have this tool. Maybe you hired a red team, or maybe you stood up a new red team or whatever. And you can see does this thing actually do what it says? And I say red team, it's actually probably better for the blue teams. The other time I've seen it is post-compromise. Bad thing happened, bad thing was done to the company, really. It doesn't just happen. And the company's all right, we missed that one. What else are we going to miss, or what else can we catch at least to know where to fix things a bit better? Which gets us then to the who's going to do it. The thesis behind this whole talk is that I think the blue teamers are the best, not just like because I have other things I want to do, but blue teamers in general are the best suited to do this testing. Start from the other end, like who is not good. Managers, SOC managers, CISOs, that kind. Some of them are awesome. Happen to work for one. Some of them, they have different priorities. They're more concerned with KPIs, closing tickets, whatnot. Sometimes they're a little less technical than would be expedient to know exactly how their tools that they're meant to have work. The other obvious answer is usually the red team, the pen testers, so on and so forth. Quick poll of the audience. Who's on the blue side of things? So about a third, maybe. How many blue teamers cringed when I was like, hey, yeah, we'll just get the red teamers to test the tools? One is honest in the crowd. All right. So we have one person who's honest anyways. But yeah, that having been said, ask us for planning. Ask us for hey, how else could you get through this? How else would you attack this? What other tricks do you have up your sleeve? Besides, we also don't really always know the entire defensive scope of the company or the organization, as it may be. And then the other, and actually probably the most often asked if the thing works is whoever's selling it. And you're like, oh, can you map this to whatever framework or matrix or whatnot? And they'll have a nice list for you of test cases they've done. And there's the benefit that it's free, hopefully. It should be anyways. There's the downside that, I have cat pictures, and that's a cool cat picture. So that's who you wouldn't ask. Who you would ask are the blue team. Ask them because they know all that, or hopefully know anyways, all the defenses that are there. They know probably the gaps. I used to work with a fellow who went from blue to red, and actually is running the red team, I think, the organization I was at now. And we had this amazing thing. He would just rock into a company we were working with, and you just go to their SOC and be like, hey, I was a SOC analyst. How do I hack you? And they'd be like, oh, dude, all you got to do is use this creds there and jump to the system. So yeah, the blue team knows. And they'll know they use these tools every day. So they're, pretty set even just from that point of view. More importantly, blue knows the environment that you're operating in. They know that, hey, we block whatever out. We block ICMP outbound, say. So no, we don't need to worry about that, even though the vendors may be iffy on that. They know some things are definitely possible. Like, man, we know that who is gets out. Happened once. We know who is gets out, and all you have to do is SSH over who is, and it works. And they know, where they may have a little less visibility, which is what this kind of testing is good. And they also know, hey, we don't just need one trick to win. On the red side, and certainly I would never do this, but some red teamers, anyways, are like, hey, I used HTTPS and it won. Hey, I used HTTPS and I got out of your network again. Hey, by the way, yeah. So it's, you get a broader scope of things. And so from that, no, it's missing. The red side does know that too. A few more side benefits you get from this. When I've done this in the past, working red, blue, the whole chain of people, communication gets a little weird. So, you find yourself I think, I need to test this, one set of activities, one set of behaviors. And the blue team, analyst or whatnot I'm working with, the SOC analyst is not quite. And then he goes talk to his manager and is like, whoa, wrong operating system, something along those lines. Also get a sort of more honest look at what needs improvement, especially if you're hiring an external team to do this. They like repeat business. And if your report that you hand a client is everything's broken, it's really hard to say, and please hire us again. It happens, but not that I would ever do this again. Cheaper, of course. And I've also found when I've worked sort of on a purple-ish, not in the modern sense of purple team, you're just hey, see this kind of thing? Hey, come look at this cool thing I'm doing. I find that oftentimes, especially junior SOC analysts and IT guys, really love the learning, how you do this one trick and such. Usually smaller scoped. So that is sort of the thesis, the why behind it. Here is sort of my own approach to testing these sorts of things. For a bit of context, mostly when I'm thinking, tool bypass, I'm really thinking about two things I have to get past. I'm thinking about automated tools, so something making an alert, and I'm thinking about whoever's doing the triage, tier 1 SOC, something along those lines. Sort of a counterexample, I know a young lad who he had a file on his desktop, I think, lol.py, and because he just thought it was funny, right? And SOC was like, oh my God, what are you doing? Deconfliction happened, and he's like, I don't even remember what he was doing, but he's like not playing League of Legends because the sock, because the sock was like, oh my gosh, file names are credible. We'll believe this. So, flip that on its head. Like, hey, if I just rename a file and it works, then it works. So, that's kind of like thought number one is, okay, it just has to work enough. Somebody asked me yesterday, like, how do you pack Linux binaries? And I'm like, why? And the answer is because nothing looks. So, UPX, I guess. But yeah, so that's the kind of thing. And then, so that, dependency to figure that out is, okay, what can I get away with to get to that point? So I need to know what's not blocked. Because if something's blocked but not caught, because I also need to know what's not caught. If something's blocked and not caught, it's like, well, let's try again. Okay, respawn, go again. Likewise, if something's caught but not blocked, well, it still works. I mean, I'll get a socket manager mad at me probably, but that's kind of par for the course with red teaming. So that's kind of the two things when we're formulating these tests we're talking about to think. What can we do to avoid getting blocked? What can we do to avoid getting caught? And then it's always good to keep in the back of your mind, what else can you get away with? It's sort of the red team mentality. We have context from the red side, but like, hey, not just like, yeah, I won. Yeah, I got CEO's, dropped a report on the CEO's desktop or something, but like, what else can I do? This all turns into like fooling the system at 5-ish places. Sometimes on the sensing side. So network traffic analysis, it's sniffing, taking PCAP and whatnot. You can't be doing that for everything. So they'll just like turn things off. I know of 3 different tools that don't look at ICMP. So, okay, I can fool the sensing because it's not sensing ICMP. Processing. So if something is taking a stream of events, data, whatever, has to like turn that from some raw sensor output to something useful. So if I can break it there, that's another win, another way to break a tool, which is then informs these test cases we're going to be talking about later. Good example of that, we had a tool I was going against that was parsing HTTP. Sure. So I put at the beginning of my SSH stream like an HTTP request header, just like the one line, get something, and then just SSH after that. And then likewise from the server, I just put like an HTTP 200 OK and then like SSH after that. And that poor tool, man, it was not expecting gigs and gigs of HTTP request and response simultaneously. That broke. Likewise, decisioning is the next sort of step in this. I hate to call it a chain. It's overused, but chain. If you can break the decisioning, if you can say, hey, you sensed this thing on the wire, you looked at it, but you decided it's probably not that bad, then that's a win too. I don't have a canned example off the top of my head, but that is like fooling it where it's like, yeah, it looks okay. Alerting as well. So every so often I'll do something that, what else can I get away with? I'll do like something like that. And I'll usually say to the SOC guys, hey dudes, do you see that? And there is a tool, without naming names, of course, that, they'll say, yeah, it made an alert. And I was like, cool. Would you have seen that? And, most of the time, yes. But every once in a blue moon, it's like, well, the tool was like, no, it's not that awesome. It's not that important. So if you can break it there, and then of course the response is the other one. If even if you're like, oh my gosh, the sky is falling, but you don't actually kill the whatever needs to be killed, well, I still win. Cool. So back to this rambly philosophy. Step one, what are we actually meant to do? What is this tool really meant to do? And sometimes it's not obvious. If you get one of these enterprise grade cloud native AI ML low calorie Intel driven makes your tea in the morning thing, does not tell you what it's actually supposed to do. It tells you that like some CEO is going to buy it, but so you have to sort of sometimes really dig and figure out, okay, what does this thing actually do? And sometimes it's just as simple as like regex. Sometimes it's as simple as like matching domain names. Sometimes it gets complicated, neural nets are involved and whatever else. And then also how it does it. So if you can figure out what source of data it gets in, that much, the closer you get to like truth, for lack of a better word, the closer you get to figuring out how things work. Oh boy, my timer just locked itself. There we go. So like the network tool I was talking about, it used a packet socket or something, snarfed traffic and PCAP'd it and did some math over that. So Linux EDR thing that actually did catch me once, and it parsed audit D output. And I was like, oh, so I just have to stay out of audit D, no problem. Things like that. And so where do we find this? Well, poke around the UI, which is something that blue teamers are way better at doing than red teamers. Speaking only for myself, I poke around like EDR, AI, UIs, and I'm like, man, I could be doing other things. False positives as well. So if the tool, whatever it is, says, hey, this is a bad thing, like the lol.py, like, oh my God, he's running a forbidden game. Okay, we know it's looking for games. Let's validate that. Let's try another game. Let's try something pretending to be a game, so on and so forth. In a similar situation, I found out it was like Mac app, like .app directory things. That was just a name matchy thing. Spotify was not allowed by technical policy, but allowed by like HR policy. And it turned out Spotify.app worked really good. And I had music, and the SOC was not happy. Documentation also. Documentation can be misleading, by the way. But, just like if it says, hey, turn this thing on to catch this thing. But it can be misleading. There is a tool out there. My name is not on it, and hopefully it never will be. But there is a like bug report in that the documentation says it blocks X and allows Y. And it actually allows X and blocks Y. So, yeah, take it for what it's worth. Previous incidents as well. If you had a thing that happened and it did not get caught, you're like, maybe that should get caught. Or you had a thing that happened, and it's an incident, so somehow you knew how it happened. That's a good way of saying, hey, this should get caught. So a call I had once, and by call, like I was doing something, and someone's like, what are you doing? And it was like, hey, you have some AWS creds, don't you? And I was like, no. And they were like, yeah, you do. You're coming from the wrong network for those creds. Okay, so I know that whatever tool that was, I don't know what tool it is because don't tell me, but whatever tool that was, I know like it catches AWS creds from a weird place. That's good. It's good. Less good sources that still may give you good information about what a tool does. The sales pitch itself, especially if you can get like a sales engineer that will give you good information. And also false negatives. If you have a team that does a thing and they're like, hey, did you catch this? And they're like, no. Yeah, take that. And then let's take these, what's this tool meant to do, and compile it into sort of a list of use cases. This can be all the way from really specific things like, I would like to match DNS names that are longer than 18 characters and catch DNS tunneling, just to like, I want exfil blocked. And then we should also ask, what should this tool do? What would we like this tool to do, especially if we're looking for a replacement for a tool? If it's something like, yeah, we have this thing, it's not working all that good, let's find another thing, kind of a wish list. It does happen, and I've seen this before. Vendors are just like, oh yeah, that would be a good thing to block. So like I mentioned the 18-character DNS thing. It was a friend of mine was going against a DNS something, and the client specifically said, hey, could you do DNS tunneling? We want to see how this looks in our tools. And I just happened to have some code to hand him, and I handed it to him, and the blue guys came back and were like, you didn't do DNS tunneling. And he's like, well, I did. And they're like, well, your domain names were too short. So okay, lesson learned for them. Maybe we shortened the length of domain names just because the vendor was like, oh yeah, I guess you can tunnel out with 3-character subdomains. Regulatory requirements as well, especially if you work in PCI DSS fintechy type things. Finding credit card numbers is always if something can identify credit card numbers and 3 CVV numbers and whatnot, that's an excellent ask. It's next to impossible, but it's a good thing to think about, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Trade magazines, I find, come from above, usually. Did this thing, and I was like, hey, I found a power strip several jobs ago. I found a power strip on, loose. I could log in and shut down a server rack, and they're like, cool story, bro. And then 6 months later, some trade mag or some CISO magazine or whatever had oh my God, you can get hacked by IoT. I just happened to have a report ready for that. It's had a funny date on it, but All right, so we kind of have our wish list, high-level wish list of use cases. In the terminology, use case, test case, everybody's going to use different terms. That's cool. So let's then come up with kind of a list of test cases, more technical, things we can put on the wire. It's a good idea to keep these small, a pass-fail or a severity of alert or something. It's also a good idea to keep it part of, notionally part of some larger scenario. Part of something that's either a cool hack that happened. So in Electronic Arts lost some source code, and came out. It was a Slack cookie that was owned. A team came to me and was like, "Hey, could you talk to us about Slack cookies?" And I had a neat little demo, and some learnings happened, and some fixes happened. It was good. But the test, if you wanted to call it that, was just can I put this Slack cookie in a browser? Well, yeah, of course. I could, anyways. So. Make it part of a larger scenario that gives you a bit of impact, gives you a bit of credibility, and makes it easier for the people who are reading these results to kind of figure out, oh yeah, this is actually useful. You could also take it just from knowledge of how things could happen. Like I said, the guy I knew was just hey, SOC, how do we own you? And they're like, yeah, sure. So that sort of chain of events, and they knew okay, we should probably worry about this. Then there was just little bit oh yeah, this one little thing, it does actually work. And, helpful tests. And then sometimes, bad things are done. And, you can take your tests and go on that. There was an organization I heard of, and had some crypto miner stuff and some, comms out. And the question was like, hey, can we test like just the comms that were similar to what happened? And I could see that actually. And so we did. And it was HTTP requests in a loop. It was nothing big, but it was a useful thing. And a question like, hey, do our tools that are supposed to catch C2 actually catch this? It was years ago. I have no idea if they did or not. Also, when you're putting together these test cases, keep as few confounding factors around as possible. A, because it's good science, but B, more importantly, it's like 100% chance somebody's going to say something to the tune of, well, yeah, it worked when you did it, but you had an easier answer. It worked when you did it, but like a real bad guy. So the less of that, the better. Also, when you have a stopwatch, make sure it stays on. Cool. So then as you're coming up with these test cases, it's good to figure out like where to start. And it's really tempting to be like, I'm just going to do a whole hack from beginning to end. Sales dudes love that. If you're ever going to sell a product, like having a scenario, end-to-end scenario, like, is a very valued thing. It's not what we're doing here. We're just testing like, does this thing work? So a better idea is just start right before the thing that you're testing is supposed to come into play. So if you're going to say, hey, does this thing catch some execution? Okay, just SSH in, just RDP in, just something. Drop it to the desktop, double click, see if it works. It does work. If you're going to look at something that blocks C2, you start with code execution, SSH in, drop your thing. Don't worry about whether that gets caught. Just see like, hey, does, my HTTP out to something weird get caught? It is highly likely that at some point, when you're doing this, you're like, yeah, we assumed access to whatever. Someone will come back and say, yeah, but if somebody has access to whatever, we have bigger problems. You've done two things there. Yes, that's what the tool is for. And then you've also identified sort of a bigger problem in the organization as like the security mindset. So anyways, once you have this list of test cases, like single testable things, make a list. So you have a list of use cases, list of test cases. And then the last thing is try and get caught. Like, do it. Which is very situationally dependent. It's very like way outside the scope of the talk how to like test all the things. But essentially it's hacking light. It's all like the fun bits of hacking without like the setting up infrastructure and really boring stuff. You'll need some sort of hacker tools. The vast majority of the hacker tools I use involve SSH and like cat and grep. But you'll need something to test it, especially if you're on the network side of things. A great place to find this is search results. Favorite search engine. Some search engines are less great about getting things on the first page, but the second page is forget the fellow's name. I'll never remember, but he says, the one thing I'm worried about, Blue Teamer, one thing I'm worried about is like a monkey armed with GitHub, I think is what he said. So yes, Google proof. See if not supposed to name things. Apologies. Yeah, see if it's Google proof. For host endpoint based things, the GTFO bins and the lol bins projects are great sources. They'll just give you a list of like commands you could run to do bad things. By the way, if you're interviewing somebody and you're like, find the one command that does weird things, and you let like open internet ability, totally go to this website. And more, to that point, also roll your own. Like if there's nothing out there that tests the exact use case you want, that's cool. It's always surprising to me, like how like 8 lines of Python were discovered 5 years later, or how like, really like terribly written implants work. There's this one that was Iranian malware, I think. It was DNS tunneling. And I re-implemented it as best I could from reporting. I took it to a client site, was like, hey, let's test and see, this kind of thing. And it like broke immediately because like they were blocking the IP address scheme type thing that this tool used. I'm like, how did this actually work? I wrote the thing, I think, during a meeting because I was bored that day. So yeah, take it. It's totally, there's the argument like, hey, is this realistic? Yeah, hackers do whatever, it works. As you're doing this, think about impact. You don't necessarily have to like drop something, it works, and then, get domain admin, but it does make a better story when you can say, hey, this thing happened. It's good, like, hey, this, whatever we did made an alert, so it's obviously bad, or we hope it is anyways. That's a start, but some human visible-ish something is better. If you can, make the test such that somebody sees something, add yourself to an LDAP group. I know a fellow, and that's like, he just gets bored, and he ends up in LDAP groups. And then we end up with things to fix. Less and less these days, which is quite nice. And the more real you make these tests, the more real you execute the tests, the more credible it is. And by this, I mostly mean where you're doing them. So user endpoints, don't just like go up to somebody and say, hey, can I hack you, please? But, something configured reasonably similarly. It's not great to say like, oh yeah, we just got domain admin, but the box didn't have the normal set of defensive tools on it because, there's the question like, would that have blocked it? Prod network as well, with care. If you don't have care, I got this message one day, and I got the message after I figured out how to reconnect to the network. And the message was, our CEO would really like you to stop breaking the Wi-Fi. So test and prod carefully. On the blue side, another benefit is you know how things look in security tools, you know how things look in defensive tools, so you don't have to worry about like false positives. You're going to hopefully have them. But you also have hopefully a much better idea than red side does how things are laid out and how to not break things. Anyway, so you have all this, test cases and list, update the list with results. So now I'd like to take a few minutes and look at sort of a kind of real-ish case study. And like I said in the beginning, originally I was going to, think of something I've gone against, tested, and be like, all right, here, and just change the names to protect the innocent. That wouldn't be very kind. So let's not do that. Instead, the tool we're going to go against is kind of a mishmash of several other real-life things. All of what we're going to talk about has happened, just not in one tool. Recap what we'll do in the case study. We're going to work out what this tool is meant to do and also what we'd like it to do. We'll figure out some test cases and we won't actually do it, but notionally get caught. Also, please note when you're doing this, there's no need for this all to be this formal. Like it can totally just be like, got some time one day and write it. I don't know how many times I've sat in meetings that I wasn't really part of. Like I was there because, I don't know, they wanted somebody with long hair and a beard. And I was like, I'll just write this thing. And then like a month later, I'm like, let's use this thing and see what happens. So every situation, of course, is different. So here's our super duper effective tool, which is really not one tool, but it's a network-based bad guy catcher and maybe bad guy sometimes blocker. And in the sales pitch, again, notional, they were like, this thing catches C2, this thing catches exfil, this thing catches lateral movement, so on. And what we've sort of figured out is it catches everything, and it's meant to block obviously bad, like high confidence malicious activity. Totally not a contrived example that works for a 40-minute talk. Okay, so step one, let's figure out what this tool is meant to do. So from the vendor's description, we know it catches C2 exfil lateral movement. Cool. We need a little more to go on than that, though. So we know from previous alerts, notional alerts, that DNS tunneling gets caught. Okay, that's something we can go on. We know from a friend that, high volume SSH is bad, and that a tool like this that catches exfil can reasonably be assumed to catch high volume SSH. True story, actually. A lad I know, network admin went to him, security guy, and was like, hey, why does our network traffic go like this? And he said, that doesn't happen. Our network traffic doesn't go like this. And it goes like this if you SCP out the entire company's code base, as it turns out. Then it goes like this really fast. So does somebody's paycheck. Likewise, the thing I alluded to earlier, we know that, again, somebody else quite a bit ago was compromised. Cryptocurrency dropper persistence deal was a cron job. And all it did was curl in a cron job that reached out to whatever. So we'll assume that that's probably something that should get caught. That's well within the scope of this tool. On the catch side, on the block side, from the vendor description, we know it's high confidence malicious activity. That's great. What does that mean? So let's poke into the documentation. SSH tunnels are meant to be blocked, and there is a tool that does this. And it's like, hey, we will not allow SSH tunnels to be made, only point-to-point shell type things. Sure, that's cool. And then we just take a first page of search results, like high confidence malicious activity or just known malware, and see what's there. So you'll get some pretty old stuff that hopefully is caught. You'll get some maybe modern stuff that hopefully is caught. There are a few tools out there that, without naming names, that are really, really common to see in the wild. If you can convince somebody to spend a couple $1,000 for a license, that would be an excellent test case for almost everything. And then we'll say from a previous job, another true story, we'll just comms to a malicious IP. We were using this network scanner tool, and the guy who was not actually on our team, who was using the tool from our infrastructure for his own purposes, like work purposes, not that kind of own purposes, called him and was like, hey, dude, what you got against Russia? And he's supposed to be like 10.network, right? Like internal. He's like, cool dudes, I guess. And turns out there was a bug in the tool. But one of the defensive systems was like, one of the defensive tools was like, hey, yeah, comms to known C2 address, comms to like some IP that is known to harbor bad things. Nowadays, this was before everything went to cloud. It's a little less high fidelity, but we'll just assume for the sake of a case study in 10 minutes that that's a thing. And then sort of like stretch goals. Like, hey, what else can we get this to catch? So we'll just ask the red team. There is a red teamer that at least one will say, try ICMP. I know of at least 3 tools that block it. Add that to the list. Another person to ask is the people who deal with regulators. Like, hey, if we could use defensive tools to help with regulatory oddity things, and it's a conversation I've had before, what would it be? And the answer I got, working for a fintech, is credit card numbers. Like, yeah, cool. If that happens, sure. So we have a list of use cases. Like I said, make a list. Here's our list. We will go against DNS tunneling, high volume SSH, periodic HTTP requests on the catching side. We'll try and test SSH tunneling, known malware, Google search engine results, and some malicious IP on the blocking side. And we'll just throw some ICMP tool at it and maybe some fake, but, pass the LUN check, credit card numbers, see what happens. That then turns into a bunch of test cases, which look something like this. Do I have a little pointer thing? No. Sometimes Google gives you pointers, and sometimes it doesn't. The cursor's visible. Yeah, so we'll just lump them sort of into 3 things that our imaginary tool is meant to do. It's meant to catch C2 protocols, and we'll have a bunch of test cases. Meant to catch well-known malware, a bunch of test cases. Meant to catch exfil, a bunch of test cases. I will not read these all out, I promise. Would like to point out a couple that are sort of interesting. It doesn't have to be elegant necessarily. This is actually a way to get DNS exfils on Twitter. You can actually get DNS exfil this way. We're testing a network thing. It doesn't really matter that, the likelihood of finding something like that in your logs is low. Once wrote something similar to this, and like the guy next to me was like hugging his tummy and rocking back and forth. And at that point I realized Perl is an awesome language to write things in. Cause I would have trouble reading that. Somebody looking at that, like catching it, same thing. Gives me another hour. And then similar on the simple side, here's that curl in a loop I was talking about. That's curl in a loop. That's all that is. So that works. And they can be really simple, or you can go complicated. So we were talking about, first page of search result. I literally typed in like DNS tunneling, enter. And there is a tool. I changed the name, but there's a tool written in Ruby that I've used before. It's a pretty good tool. Throw it on there, see if it works. That kind of thing. Anything else of note? No. So also worth mentioning, it doesn't have to be exactly faithful. So this was SCP, was the high volume SSH thing. SCP on the wire is going to look like SSH because it's tunnel over SSH, right? So that is sort of that. A few tips that I've just learned over the years. When you're going to do this, use long format options in syntax. So things like curl here, I probably should just use hyphen silent there, much like down here form. That way when you're reading it, and more importantly, when you hand this spreadsheet to somebody's going to ask for the spreadsheet. You hand the spreadsheet to somebody with like red boxes everywhere or whatever, it'll be a lot more obvious what it is. Speaking of the spreadsheet, make a copy. It has happened in the past, years ago, that I had this nice spreadsheet, color-coded and all sorts of good notes and whatnot, and we were handing it to somebody, I forget who. And it turns out that my spreadsheet changed, and things that I was like, hey, this is important for whoever it was to know, were deemed not as important by probably a sales guy. So yeah, copy your spreadsheet. You might need it. I did not, and then I had to go like reconstruct it. Also, make sure your tools are fairly easy to use. Without getting into details, there was a tool set that I wrote to do this sort of thing that is still in use at an organization that I have not been a part of for a few years now. But, I turned it into just sort of like a draggy, double-clicky thing. And yeah, it worked pretty good. Keeping logs is also important. PCAP is good as a log. And I've had many people say, hey, can you give me the PCAP for that? I am not entirely sure what somebody's going to do with 100 gig of SSH PCAP, but somebody will ask. And likewise, just logs of like what you're doing. Screen recordings are also not a bad thing. When I was talking about that ICMP thing, the vendor was like, hey, can you send us a screen recording of you abusing ICMP? And I did. And I hit up arrow and enter. And it was like done. Happened. And then last but not least, and it will happen, come prepared with answers to the hand wavy, like, no, that could never happen. There are no droids here. Move along. You'll find yourself in these meetings where, like, you'll start the meeting and you'll be like, yeah, so I tested, I don't know, just to pull one of these things out. Yeah, we wrote a tool to do ICMP tunneling. We were, had some time, we wrote it. And, it worked. And then somebody will be like, yeah, but, you can sit and write tools. The bad guy class, we're not really worried about the, FSB or something. We're worried about, like, our lower level hackers. They're not going to be able to write their tools. Only focus on, like, known malware. And then you'll sit in the meeting and you'll be like, yeah, so we also did this thing where we use curl and loop, like, kind of the lower level guys you're talking about. And somebody will invariably tell you, yeah, but, we're looking at more sophisticated adversaries. It's a true story. I mean, these things happen all the time in meetings. And you're sitting there thinking, like, all right, either I'm a wizard or I'm a knucklehead. I don't know which I am. And then sometimes you can be mathematical impossibilities, and I've been there too. I was working with a group of mathematicians who were using math that is not sort of math I understand to catch bad guys and, like, take various data points and turn that into a score, basically. And one of them was convinced that, I think it was like a 1 minute beacon interval or something, was not a malicious beacon interval. I had a shell with a 1 minute beacon interval at that point, but these things happen. So yeah, be prepared to be, you'll have all sorts of sort of resolution of cognitive dissonance things. They happen, or to be mathematically impossible. All right, quick recap. So tools, it's really hard to know if they actually work when you're using them before you just test them. And even if you test them, you'll only know if they work for what you've tested, but it's still quite a bit better than probably. I think blue teamers, sort of the thesis of the talk, the best people to test are blue teamers. You have the most knowledge. You have the most skin in the game, really. So, you're the best. And then when you do the testing itself, figure out what the tool should do, come up with some test cases, and do it. Thank you for watching. Happy to take questions if there are any. And again, that will link you to the slides, which links you to all the fun stuff. None. It's like pub is open now. Oh, all right, non-drinker there.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the amazing talk. Was very interesting. You let me think. It is true that the red team can help, sure. But you also, when you are testing the tool, because at the end that is the message you gave us, that we need to test in order to check that the tool actually works. Sure. We need to think like the attacker. So in a way, we need to think like the red team is thinking. You're just curious. What do you think?
I have a slide for you.
Okay.
Yeah. So things I'm thinking with regards to one tool. These are the things on my brain, on my mind. Mostly I'm thinking I have to fool tier one or whatever is automated, whatever the first step that makes a decision. Because if whatever the first step that makes that decision, decisioning right here, whatever that is, if that's like, yeah, it's cool, then yeah, it's cool. So that's the first thing, and then figure out what I can do that won't get blocked. Maybe it blends in. Maybe there's just no capability against it. And things I do that won't just not get blocked, but won't get caught. There's subtle differences there. So that's kind of in one half of a slide, sort of the mentality there. Yeah. But happy to talk to you afterwards. Much longer conversation if you'd like. Yeah. Good question though. Any other questions? All right. Cool. Thank you very much.